like Esther Perel says to you, like, why do you want to live longer? Like when you're so miserable, which sets in motion, this journey towards recovery. So talk a little bit about what was going on with you leading up to this realization.
I think there were really two big things that were obviously related, but temporally distinct. So I think by 2016, 2017, I was probably working. I was working really hard. I was traveling constantly. My wife was pregnant with our third child. I was nowhere to be found. My two kids that were at the time, my daughter and my son, didn't actually think I lived at home. They actually thought I lived in New York or San Francisco or wherever the hell else I was traveling. Had offices in two different places and all this kind of stuff. But I think it's worse than that, right? Like I wish I could just say, oh, it's just that I was like a super hardworking father who was like just working really hard to make a lot of money for his family. No, I think it was also that I was getting more and more detached, and more just sort of selfish. I think naturally I'm a very selfish person, and I think that selfishness was just growing and growing and growing. And the event that comes to a head that I write about is after our youngest son is born in June of 2017. I barely make it home for his birth. I don't think I write about that, but I was in New York when my wife went into labor. She was annoyed that I even went to New York the week she was due. Mm-hmm. But I was like, yeah, don't worry, I'll make it back. And of course, I barely make it back. So I get to the hospital maybe an hour before he's born. And then 2 days later, I'm back on the road. And about 5 weeks later, I'm in New York. A friend of mine from Boston is in town. We're getting ready to go out. And I get a call from her, and she says, our youngest son just had a cardiac arrest. I'm in the ambulance with him. We're heading to, UCSD Radies.
He's an infant.
He's 5 weeks old, yeah. And he, we still to this day don't really know what happened. He probably just had some awful vasovagal insult, but, by some miracle, it happened during the day. The nanny saw him roll his eyes back and turn blue. And luckily, my wife is a nurse practitioner. She's done critical care her whole life. So just did CPR, and I'm like, put him on the floor, sternum compressions, the whole thing, while the nanny calls the paramedics. 4 or 5 minutes later, they're there just as he's coming back. And for reasons that, I can finally say this without breaking down, but for reasons I'll never understand, I just didn't get on a plane to go home. I was just so detached. I literally just treated it like it was a patient. I was like, okay, call me when you get to the ICU. And then for the next 5 days, I just did a check-in with the doctors every day. And I didn't drag myself home until 10 days later.
10 days later, you came home.
Yeah. And it was just so blind to what an asshole I had become. And honestly, it's something my wife's only read, to this day, my wife's only read one chapter of that book. She hasn't read the book yet, because it's not out yet. Mm-hmm. But I did ask her to read that chapter. I wouldn't have written that chapter without her blessing. Because I know that that's something my kids are going to read one day. And my son will read that one day. He's 5 today, but he's going to read that one day and know that his dad didn't come home. Mm-hmm. And it's so funny. He says, I don't know how he knows this, but he must have heard us saying this, but he always says, Mommy saved me. And lately he's been saying, Daddy, did you save me too? And I say, no, I didn't, Ari. I didn't save you. Mommy saved you. Daddy wasn't there. Why weren't you there? He's starting to ask these questions. And
you're the healer. This is your identity.
Yeah. So there will be a reckoning for this. There will be. Yeah. There's no question. So as the summer of 2017 bled into the fall of 2017, I was spiraling out of control. There's just, I don't know what was driving all of this, but I almost got into a fight in a parking lot with someone. And this is this was more than just a shouting match. I was going to kill someone in a parking lot over nothing. Literally, some guy left a note on my car, a chirping note at my car. And I was like, oh, really? Mm-hmm. So around this time, Paul Conti, who is one of my closest friends, we were we met the first day of med school and immediately connected over our love for Ayrton Senna, who my youngest is actually named after. And Paul and I shared an office in New York, so we saw each other all the time. And he just said, I think you need to go somewhere. I think you need to go somewhere for like residential care. And I was just completely reluctant to do this. I mean, he talked about you need to go into a trauma. He was talking about this place called the Bridge to Recovery, which is for trauma. And I was like, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense, dude. Like, what are you talking about? And he goes, you gotta trust me. Like, you live like a trauma victim. Everything about you is a response to trauma. And I don't know what it is, but he just basically said in a non-condescending way, you kind of just gotta trust me. And so ultimately I did go there. I went there at the end of 2017. And at some point they gave me a piece of paper that had all the different types of emotions. And they were like, just see which one of these you are. Like, I know you say it's anger, but there must be something besides anger. Like, is it anger because of hurt? Is it anger because of embarrassment? Is it anger? Like, they were really trying to help me expand my vocabulary because I sort of showed up as a monosyllabic idiot, right? So, the 2 weeks I spent at the Bridge was absolutely the beginning of the change. But I think incorrectly left after 2 weeks. And everybody sort of felt I really needed to be there for at least 6 weeks because it's really designed as a bigger program. The first 2 weeks is really just to uncover what the heck is going on, but you don't get handed any of the skills to go about fixing it. So even when I came back, I wasn't really in a position to kind of fix anything.
Sure. Yeah. It's interesting. Like, you leave AMA, right? Like, the patient, the smart doctor guy is a terrible patient. You're somebody who resides in your mind. You pride yourself on your intellect. You're a very smart guy. These are people that are very resistant to this type of help, right? Like, I understand this intellectually. I get it. Like, I'm going to now solve this problem with my brain, not understanding that it is that brain that created the problem to begin with. And the journey towards recovery involves disentangling all of that, letting go, and allowing people in to help you. But you're somebody who is, basically fueled by self-will and your own sort of independent way of doing things outside of any external inputs.
And the interesting thing is, I think when I left the Bridge, I was definitely cracked open. And I think I did great things when I got out in terms of, like, it's not like I didn't, do therapy. And Esther introduced me to a guy named Terry Reel, who was amazing. But there was also certain things I missed that I think you only get in residential care. And one of the things was every night at the Bridge, you went to a 12-step meeting in town. So every single night, imagine that for 14 straight nights, you were at a 12-step meeting. And they don't care which 12-step meeting it is. So I was doing AA, SA, like NA, it didn't matter. I went to all of them.
But are you just like leaning back?
Well,
crossed?
Initially, of course I was. Initially, I was like, why am I here? I don't even have my phone. Like, what am I doing here? Like, ugh. But I'll tell you, by the time I started to crack open, I was really moved by this. And I remember when I got back to San Diego thinking, I wish I could go to a 12-step meeting, even though I'm not an alcoholic. Like, I want to listen to what they're saying. Like, I want to hear that there's someone else who's struggling with something. And I think that was a missed opportunity.
Yeah. So a seed is planted. You've got Paul. You've got some introduction to the notion that trauma plays a role. You are resistant to the idea of being an addict in any way. Like, I'm not an addict. Like, I almost got in a fight, and I realized, like, I worked too hard and I'm not present with my family. But does that really put me in the category of these other people? Like, you're struggling with your ability to connect and relate to, what is being presented to you.
And I think I started to fix, I guess it was probably by about the summer of 2018, I really did start to make some really big improvements with my wife. And I really started to heal from all of that hurt. Now, I was still working way too hard. I was still traveling like a dog. And I don't write about this in the book, but this goes on for another year until November of 2019. I have probably the closest I've ever had to a nervous breakdown at the time. It was actually in Austin. So this is when I still live in San Diego. Every year I go out to watch Formula One.
Mm-hmm.
And so sure enough, I go out to Austin to see Coda. And I had an amazing lead up to it. Hosted a bunch of podcasts. There were some people I wanted to interview there. The morning of the race, I wake up and I just have a total anxiety attack, which I've never had in my life. And I decide I can't go to the race. So I just call an Uber, go to the airport and go home. I miss the race. And I get home and my wife thinks it's really weird. And she assumes it's, well, maybe he's just feeling like really burnt out and just needs to be with us more. But something was definitely broken. And the next day our team was in town. We were supposed to be making a bunch of content videos. And I just completely flipped out. I was at the whiteboard literally trying to make the first one and I made a mistake and I flipped out. Like, I was like, I'm done. We're done. Like, this whole thing's over.
This was 2020.
2019.
Oh, this is before the stuff you talk about in the book. Okay.
Yep.
Wow.
And then I spiraled into a very deep hole of very significant thoughts of self-harm, very, very, very desperate. So bad that Paul actually flew down to San Diego and we holed up in a hotel for a day.
Mm.
And Paul's diagnosis at that time was crystal clear, which is you are so angry at yourself for how much you punish yourself that you're kind of turning your anger inward now at the guy who's been whipping you. Like, there's a guy inside who whips you and you are now so angry at him that you want to hurt him.
Mm.
And he's like, you have got to stop this. And I was like, okay, I'll start taking, I just did this stupid thing of like, I'll do a little bit less. And I limped along until I didn't.
The elevator's going down. You had a couple opportunities to step off, but you needed a little bit more pain.
Yeah.
So 2020, it really all comes to a head.
Yeah. And I think I would have been able to limp along for another couple of years had it not been sort of the acute crisis of COVID. And who knows, maybe it would have happened regardless, but it all kind of came to a head one day in a really scary way. And it's really weird that we're talking about all this because I just think people are going to, I still to this day when I talk about this stuff, well, I've never really talked about this publicly. So there's a part of me that worries that, there's a side of me I'm just not sure I want people to know about. But so on this particular Wednesday, in April of 2020, started like any other day, right? So wake up, and it wasn't like any other day because this was, slightly, this is during COVID. So it was, different hours. I sort of scheduled a day where I would do my work early in the morning because we had an East Coast team. So we'd start calls at 6 a.m, et cetera. A lot of my rituals are kind of gone. A lot of the sort of things I do for self-help are being thrown out the window. But I always, do something for pleasure before I work out. So I'm either going to go and shoot my bow and arrow or go and get in my simulator and drive. And then exercise. And then, by 10 o'clock, I get back to work. So I go out to shoot my bow and arrow. And I'm really shooting poorly. Now, archery is a pretty objective thing. Like, there's X's and you're trying to hit them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm off. And I am so pissed off that I take these carbon arrows and I start snapping them on my thigh. Now, these things leave welts on your legs that last for a week when you break them. That's how much it hurts. And I couldn't stop breaking them on my leg. Every one of them. And then I decided in my infinite wisdom that the best thing I could do then is go and get in the simulator and drive.
Right. Let's
because
just ramp this up another
well,
notch.
because it's like, look, I didn't get the self-validation doing this thing. I'm going to go find another way to get self-validation. So I go and get in the simulator, get into the hardest car on the hardest circuit, and sure enough, I'm spinning. Just can't keep the car in control. Amazingly, I don't break the simulator. And then I decide, okay, I'm going to go and work out. And for the first time in my life, I'm actually too upset to work out. Like I don't have the motor control to lift weights. Which is it just strikes me as an impossible scenario. The rest of that morning spirals out of control, but culminates with me absolutely losing my mind and taking a table in our living room and throwing it across the living room.
Wow.
At which point my wife comes running in thinking that the house has been broken into. And the rest of it is a bit of a blur. Her, at first, trying to console me, but then quickly realizing it's way too dangerous to be near me. And then just telling me to get out. I ended up in a motel. And didn't eat or drink anything for, I guess, 3 days. Was on the phone with Paul, Esther, Terry, convincing them that I was ready to go home, and all of them saying, absolutely not. Like, if you go home, we're going to call the police.
Wow.
Like, there's only one thing that left for you to do. You have to go to this place called PCS, Psychological Counseling Service, which is this place in Phoenix. And of course, I just fought with them for hours. I was like, I can't do it. I can't do it. And they're like, you're missing the point. You're acting like we're giving you a choice.
Because don't you know who I think I am, and I'm so busy and I have all these responsibilities, or I can't do it because I'm too scared to do it. I mean, obviously there's
probably a bit of both, but it's all being.
Sure.
I'll tell you what the fear was, Rich. Truthfully, the fear was I'm not fixable, so why are we fucking around with this?
And that's really the core of the whole thing, right? Like that's what starts to get revealed. Like, what is behind this rage? What is the relationship between that rage and trauma and your relationship, not only with your past, but with yourself, right?
Yeah. So I think the surface fear is it's impossible for me to go away for a week. And they said, it could be 1, it could be 2, it could be 3. That's going to be decided by them. But I said, even a week is impossible because I can't go off the grid. Like when you're at these places, as I'm sure you know, you don't have a phone.
Sure.
You're not doing anything. Like you're in therapy 13 hours a day, 7 days a week, group therapy, individual therapy. I mean, it's the most exhausting thing you can do. But you're absolutely right. Underneath it was the much deeper fear, which is, I'm that guy. I'm that guy who has to go into rehab every 3 years and never gets fixed. Just euthanize me. Like, why are we doing this nonsense?
Right. And it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's this tension or dichotomy of kind of holding two contradictory perspectives on yourself. On the one hand, look at me. I'm so successful. I have all these responsibilities. From the outside looking in, it appears that everything is together. And I know how to solve this better than anyone because I'm me, right? And on the other hand, I'm the worst piece of shit in the world. I should just die. I am broken. It's irreparable. Like, who cares? Why even try?
And you're absolutely correct. And then on top of that, there's the shame of, God forbid, anybody actually think I'm special if they could only see how horrible I am.
Right. Right. And the fear that at least publicly anyone would know that you have some fallibility.
Especially so deep, right? It's one thing to be like, oh, I eat too much chocolate or something like that. But this to me was like a rot to the core of like who I was, right? This was not just a quirk of personality or a I struggle with smoking or something. No, this struck me as like a fundamental, like this was to me the lowest possible, set of character traits one could have.
Which also creates the best place to begin this kind of work, right? Like that you hit bottom.
Yeah.
So hopefully that creates a space of willingness to entertain a new way.
Yes, it's sad to say I had to hit rock bottom. And of course, here we are 3 years later. My life is completely different in all ways, infinitely better. People, sometimes people say to me, it's a question I think you can ask anybody, right? Like if you could go back and talk to the 20-year-old version of you, what would you tell him? What would you do different? On the one hand, I wish I could say, figure this stuff out 30 years sooner, buddy.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're going to save everybody, including yourself, but more importantly, people you love, you're going to save them so much pain. On the other hand, I think I don't know if I could have figured this out unless I was on in the basement.
Right.
Like I think, at least for me, I needed to be in so much pain to actually do this thing, to go through this stuff. I mean, do you think about that the same way?
You and me both, buddy. When you present emotional health as this core pillar in HealthSpan, on the kind of subject of early intervention, like all of this is about like how do we catch these things, diagnose them, and start treating them way earlier on than we historically have been doing. The tricky thing with emotional health is it does require willingness. So you could, if somebody came up to you when you were 28 or 24 or 30 or whatever and tried to intervene and get you to understand that this is important, there's no way that you would have been game to, dive into this, right? So it's a lot more difficult. But perhaps had that intervention occurred when you were 8 years old, or there were modalities in place to, help you make sense of confusing things, in your childhood during that period of time, it could have created a different trajectory.
Yeah. For me, the sign that this was really, I was ready to go through it was the most important thing I had to let go of was whatever changes I'm about to make will result in me being less effective in my professional life.
That's the big one.
Yeah.
That's the big one. And that gets to the root of your sense of self and the incident, workaholism that's a manifestation of that sense of that unhealthy sense of self. Like the facts of your experience, as they say in the parlance of recovery, like the facts of your experience are very different from mine, but the emotional landscape is so relatable to me. Like there's a lot of overlap. Like we've, manifested our disorders in different ways, but it's so similar to me in so many ways. And there is that thing of nurturing that dysfunction under the illusion or the belief that that is the engine from which you've been able to create a pretty great life. And if you're to dismantle that, then what becomes of you? Like you aren't going to be able to do the thing that you do that has distinguished you and crafted this identity and sense of self.
Yeah, and
all the success, everything.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, maybe by some metric, I'm less successful and less driven today than I would be had I stayed on that path. But the opportunity cost of that was too great. And I'm actually really comfortable with that.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I never thought could go away, I talk about this in the book, is the whole Bobby Knight thing. This was one of the most important realizations I ever had when I was at PCS, which is what my inner monologue sounded
Mm-hmm.
like. And it sounds, well, it's a little hard to believe I wasn't aware of it, given that it wasn't just an inner monologue. It was actually also an outer monologue. I would constantly say things to myself out loud. Whenever I made mistakes, the self-talk was not just in my head. It was verbal. It would come out.
Mm-hmm.
And it was awful, right? It was, the reason I called that Bobby Knight is that's who it was modeled after, right? It was, Coach Knight is going to strangle you if you make a mistake. And it was anything, right? It didn't matter. If I screwed up making dinner, if I screwed up a shot, if I screwed up anything, if I was late to a call. I remember one morning I woke up and there was a call on my calendar at 6 that I had forgot about. And when I woke up, I did a whole bunch of other things before it and I missed the call. I mean, instead of just emailing the person and saying, hey, I'm really sorry. I mean, I must have beat myself up about that for a day.
Uh-huh.
And this exercise that they had me do there was one of the most powerful things I've ever done. And when they suggested it, I thought, that seems kind of dumb. Like, there's no way that's going to work. And they were like, every single day, 2 or 3 times, something is going to happen that's going to prompt you to want to scream at yourself. Take out your phone and record a message, but look into the eyes of your best friend and pretend that they made that mistake. What would you say to them? I mean, the first 2 times I did this, I was in tears because it was such a shift of how kind I would speak to that person. You know, hey, Peter, I know it's frustrating. You just, didn't have a good drive today, but, I think there's a lot on your mind today. And you did okay, but, you got to watch the apex going into this corner. And like, I was like talking like I was a kind coach.
Yeah.
And there was an accountability where every one of those I would send to my therapist. So Katie Powell would get every one of those as a text message. She'd get like 2 or 3 of these voice messages a day for 4 months. And it only took about 4 months for that to go away. That is really amazing to me.
Yeah, that's powerful.
Think of how old I am and think of how many years I had this ingrained pattern of screaming at myself. And I mean, I don't even want to repeat the stuff I say because it's so vile, but like, it's not like, you idiot. No, it's much harsher than that. And in just 4 months of being mindful of this every single day, I don't even remember. It's so hard for me to remember Bobby's voice.
That's a powerful testament to neuroplasticity, that you could rewire that, because that is so deeply ingrained. That's something that I share, this inability to extend compassion to myself that is second nature to extend to another human being. I don't think you know this, but before Christmas, I I went up and spent a week at Paul Conti's clinic.
No, I didn't
doing
know.
some trauma work and family of origin work, and it was revelatory for many, many reasons. Like, I'm just so grateful that I was able to have that experience, and I learned a ton. But perhaps the biggest revelation that came out of that was this very thing of my inability to exercise self-compassion. Like, the negative self-talk and the standard to which I hold myself is far beyond anything that I would expect of anybody else, to the point of just, utter cruelty, and the extent to which this not only runs deep, but infects like everything that I do to my detriment. So first, obviously I've kind of always known this, but like really trying to understand that, and then creating that lattice work to understand how that relates to childhood trauma, and then beginning the process of undoing it, like, has been, it's been extraordinary. Despite like all the years that I've been in recovery, like everything that I've done, I still have had some of this sort of repressed rage that would come out periodically. Not to the extent that it did with you, but enough where my wife would be like, you really need to figure out like why you're behaving this way, or why this stuff kind of comes up. And I sort of delayed it, and I would rationalize like, well, I'm doing all these other things. Like, what else do I need to do? But there was this thing sitting there, like just waiting, like a ticking time bomb that needed to be looked at. And the fact that I, took a week to, just begin that process has been extraordinary. So I'm curious, in your case, what did you discover in terms of that rage, which I think, probably a lot of people can relate to. Like, why do I get angry at this thing or that thing? Like, how does that connect to your past, and how did you begin to like make sense of that so that you could untangle it?
I think as you obviously learned with Paul, I mean, I think there are lots of different types of traumas. There are big T and little T traumas, right? There are, sometimes it's easy to focus on the big T ones. And I've had a big T trauma, couple, I think. But what I think I learned at PCS was I've probably been more undone by the little T traumas. It's probably more some of the neglect, and the sense of, I mean, truthfully, I think the single most important insight is that I had never until I got there. And remember how they said, you might be there for a week, 2, 3. I was there for 3 weeks. Like, I was like one of the 5% of people that was there for 21 days. I didn't have my breakthrough there till the 19th day. I mean, 2 weeks in, I thought I was better. I was ready to go home the next day. And Paul called me and said, look, we've all powwowed, me, Esther, Terry, Katie, like the whole team has powwowed with their team, and we think you are not quite there. There's one thing you're not willing to let go of. And I was like, are you freaking kidding me? What? And they're like, you haven't really accepted the fact that like the child in you was really hurt by these things and these adaptations. They're not in the child's best interest anymore. Like, your response, these things that you did as a kid are not normal childhood behaviors. If you saw your kid doing these things, you would be devastated by how sad it is, and by the loss of their innocence and by the loss of their childhood. And
in other words, sorry to interrupt, but in other words, the story that you had been telling yourself was these things happened, but ultimately they made me who I am, and they gave me this engine and propelled me to do all of these other things. And yeah, it wasn't great, but like I've made peace with it.
That's right. It was. Yeah. These things were really bad, and I get it. And I would never want my kids to endure these things, but you have to understand, like, they've been way more net positive than negative, especially now that we've figured out what these negative things are, and I have coping skills for them. And they were saying, no. You got to go back.
Such a quant perspective.
Yeah. You got to go back and realize, like, this little boy that never wanted to celebrate a birthday, like that, this little boy that wanted his daddy to be there and he wasn't there. Like, those things aren't okay. And that kind of took me down into an emotional free fall that was, I think, the final layer of excuses. Because I think you can probably relate to this, but one of the ways I had rationalized my bad behavior for so long was my kids aren't going to suffer what I suffered. And I think that addicts can sometimes do that. They can sort of say, like, I'm making this up. This wasn't the case in my case. My dad used to beat me with a belt every single day. And look, I'm not beating my kid with a belt every single day, so it's fine. Meanwhile,
give me a medal.
Yeah. And I think that was also a very important part of my motivation, was when I finally realized how much I was hurting my kids. It was, they weren't actually experiencing the traumas I experienced, but they were experiencing a whole bunch of new ones. And the kids of alcoholics don't always go on to become alcoholics, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that trauma isn't intergenerational. It really is. It weasels its way down. And that realization, coupled with being at rock bottom, was sort of like, you know what? I'm going to stop it. I don't want this going to my kids.
Yeah, there's a couple quotes from the book that kind of really hammer on that point. One of which is this idea that children take on the shame of those around them, like understanding that even if on paper you feel like you're the dutiful dad and you're protecting them, et cetera, that all of this emotional dis-ease, percolates into their conscious awareness and impacts them and their behavior later in life. And the other one being, this idea of covert male depression and this statistic that 90% of male rage is helplessness masquerading as frustration. Like, that's a zinger.
It speaks to me. And,
yeah.
That was something Terry told me one day in a therapy session. And I was talking about it with Esther recently, or not recently, like recently after that, or shortly after that. And she said, I want you to write that down on a Post-it and stick it on your monitor. I mean, it's so true. How often do I find myself, even today, getting angry about something? And if I just stop and think about it, I'm helpless. I feel helpless. I feel powerless.
Yeah.
And we're just, I think for men in particular, it's very difficult to articulate that and accept that. And it's so much easier to just channel that helplessness into some form of anger.